In the shadowy depths of Carnarvon Castle, in the year of our Lord 1312, a miracle was about to unfold, or so it appeared to the assembled court of King Arthur III of Brittany. The great hall, illuminated by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows across stone walls adorned with tapestries of conquest, held its collective breath as Nikolaus von Eckhart approached the royal table. The alchemist moved with the measured confidence of a man who commanded mysteries beyond mortal understanding. His robes, deep crimson trimmed with silver, rustled with each deliberate step. In his weathered hands, he carried a small crucible containing what appeared to be common lead, dull, worthless, the metal of peasants and roof tiles. Yet the eyes of every nobleman, every lady of the court, every ambitious courtier were fixed upon this humble vessel as if it contained the very essence of divine power. King Arthur, a man whose coffers had been emptied by endless campaigns against rival claimants and rebellious vassals, leaned forward with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The crown upon his brow, magnificent though it appeared, had become more symbol than substance. Beautiful gold covering a treasury as hollow as an empty tomb. "Behold," Nikolaus intoned, his voice carrying the weight of ancient secrets, "the great work shall be completed before your very eyes, your majesty. Lead, the basest of metals, shall become gold, the most precious, through the divine art of transmutation." What followed was a performance worthy of the greatest theater. Nikolaus poured mysterious powders into the crucible, muttered incantations in languages that sounded both holy and forbidden, and subjected the mixture to flames that seemed to burn with unnatural colors. The court watched in mesmerized silence as the alchemist appeared to work genuine magic, transforming the worthless into the priceless through sheer force of will and knowledge. When the crucible cooled and Nikolaus presented its contents to the king, the gasps of amazement echoed through the hall like thunder. There, gleaming in the firelight, lay what appeared to be pure gold, enough to fund armies, purchase loyalty, and secure kingdoms. But how far would a man go to maintain a lie that had made him king? That question would haunt not only Nikolaus von Eckhart, but everyone whose fate became entangled with his Faustian ambition.
The early 14th century was an age where the boundaries between science and superstition blurred like watercolors in rain. In the courts of medieval Europe, learned men practiced what they called natural philosophy, a discipline that encompassed everything from astronomy to alchemy, from medicine to magic. Kings and nobles, desperate for advantages in an era of constant warfare and political upheaval, would pay fortunes for any edge that knowledge could provide. It was into this world of shadowy possibilities that Nikolaus von Eckhart had been born, though not into privilege. His father had been a minor craftsman in the German states, skilled enough to work metal, but never wealthy enough to rise above his station. Young Nikolaus had shown unusual intelligence from childhood, devouring manuscripts that others could barely read, understanding principles of natural philosophy that escaped men twice his age. The path that led him to King Arthur's court had been long and arduous. Nikolaus had spent years wandering between monasteries and universities, absorbing knowledge wherever he could find it. He had studied under masters who claimed to possess the secrets of the ancient philosophers, learned men who spoke of transmutation not as miracle but as inevitable result of understanding nature's hidden laws. But knowledge without opportunity remained merely academic. The young alchemist had watched as lesser men achieved wealth and position through birth or luck, while his genuine learning earned him little more than scholarly reputation. The world, it seemed, valued gold far more than wisdom, practical results more than theoretical understanding. King Arthur III represented everything Nikolaus both envied and despised. Here was a man elevated by accident of birth to command armies and treasuries, yet possessed of so little understanding that he believed metal could be transformed through magical incantation rather than chemical process. The king's court buzzed with astrologers, fortune-tellers, and charlatans who promised easy solutions to complex problems.
What galled Nicholas most was that these fraudsters prospered while genuine scholars struggled. Men who could barely read Latin were showered with gold for predicting victory in battles, while philosophers who understood the actual movements of celestial bodies lived in poverty. The system seemed designed to reward deception over truth, spectacle over substance. The kingdom itself reflected this dysfunction. King Arthur's territories were rich in resources, but poor in management. His endless wars had drained treasuries that should have overflowed with wealth from trade and agriculture. The king borrowed constantly, taxed mercilessly, and still found himself unable to finance the campaigns necessary to maintain his throne. It was this desperation that created opportunity for men like Nicholas. A king who needed gold would pay handsomely for anyone who claimed to produce it. A court filled with superstition would embrace magical explanations over scientific ones. A society that valued results over methods would not question miracles too closely. Nicholas had arrived at Carnarvon Castle with genuine knowledge of metallurgy, chemistry, and natural philosophy. He understood more about the actual properties of metals than perhaps anyone else in the kingdom. He knew that true transmutation, if possible at all, would require processes far more complex than anything he could perform in a royal demonstration. But he also understood that truth was less powerful than illusion, that the appearance of miracle could accomplish more than actual knowledge. In a world where perception shaped reality, the man who could make lead appear to become gold would achieve more influence than the scholar who understood why such transformation was impossible. The moral weight of this realization had pressed upon Nicholas like a physical burden. He possessed the knowledge to serve truth, but lived in a world that rewarded deception. He could remain honest and poor, or become wealthy through fraud. The choice, when presented so starkly, seemed inevitable.
The genesis of Nikolaus von Eckhart's grand deception began not in a moment of calculated ambition, but in an instant of pure desperation. 3 days before his demonstration in King Arthur's court, the alchemist had stood in his modest chambers, staring at the pathetic sum of silver coins that represented his life's accumulated wealth. His genuine knowledge had earned him enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. The summons to court had arrived with the dawn, delivered by a royal messenger whose very presence transformed Nikolaus from scholarly hermit to man of potential consequence. King Arthur, the message explained, had heard rumors of an alchemist who claimed to possess the secret of transmutation. His Majesty required a demonstration within the week. Here was the opportunity Nikolaus had dreamed of, a chance to present his knowledge to someone with the power to reward it appropriately. But as he examined his equipment, his formulas, and his understanding of metallurgical processes, a terrible truth became clear. He could not produce gold from lead. Despite years of study and experimentation, despite mastery of principles that few men understood, the great work remained beyond his capabilities. The night that followed was one of agonized moral wrestling. Nikolaus paced his chambers like a caged animal, torn between honesty that would preserve his integrity and deception that might secure his future. He could admit his limitations and likely face dismissal or worse, accusation of fraud for having implied capabilities he did not possess. Or he could create an illusion so convincing that it would establish his reputation permanently. The decision crystallized around a small vial of gold powder, part of his legitimate experiments in understanding metallic properties. The powder was genuine, refined gold that he had acquired through conventional means for research purposes. But it could serve another purpose entirely if mixed cleverly with other substances and presented under the right conditions.
What Nikolaus conceived was not merely a trick, but an elaborate performance that would combine genuine chemistry with theatrical deception. He would create a chemical reaction that appeared to transform lead into gold, while actually introducing pre-existing gold through methods too subtle for observers to detect. The science would be real enough. The transformation of one substance into another through careful application of heat and reagents, but the result would be achieved through substitution rather than actual transmutation. The moral sophistication of this approach made it more dangerous than simple fraud. Nikolaus could convince himself that he was demonstrating genuine principles of chemistry, merely accelerating a process that nature might accomplish given sufficient time and proper conditions. He was not lying about the science, only about the specific mechanism by which the result was achieved. This rationalization allowed him to proceed with preparations that would have been impossible if he had acknowledged them as pure deception. He crafted specialized vessels with hidden compartments, prepared chemical compounds that would produce spectacular visual effects, and rehearsed procedures until they appeared as natural as breathing. The most insidious aspect of his plan was how it blended truth with falsehood in ways that made detection nearly impossible. Nikolaus genuinely understood metallurgy better than anyone likely to observe his demonstration. His explanations of chemical processes would be scientifically accurate. His discussion of natural philosophy would reveal profound learning, and his manipulation of materials would demonstrate authentic expertise. Only the final result, the apparent creation of gold from lead, would be fraudulent, achieved through sleight of hand rather than transmutation. But this single deception would overshadow all the genuine knowledge that surrounded it, creating an illusion so compelling that even Nikolaus might begin to believe it himself. The night before his demonstration, as he made final preparations for the performance that would define his future, Nikolaus felt the weight of a decision that could never be unmade. He was about to cross a threshold from honest scholar to magnificent fraud.
trading integrity for influence in a bargain that seemed both inevitable and damnable. Yet even as conscience warred with ambition, Nikolaus could not deny the intoxicating possibility that lay ahead. If his deception succeeded, he would gain access to resources that could fund genuine research. He would achieve the position and influence necessary to pursue the great work properly. His fraud might ultimately serve truth by providing the means to discover it. This was the original sin that would define everything that followed, not simple greed or obvious malice, but the terrible sophistication of a brilliant mind convincing itself that deception could serve noble purposes. Nikolaus von Eckhart was about to discover that the most dangerous lies are those we tell ourselves, and that the road to damnation is indeed paved with the very best of intentions.
King Arthur's reaction to Nikolaus's demonstration exceeded even the alchemist's most optimistic expectations. The monarch did not merely accept the apparent transmutation as genuine, he embraced it with the fervor of a man who had found salvation itself. Within hours of the ceremony, Nikolaus found himself elevated from wandering scholar to royal confidant, installed in chambers that rivaled those of the greatest nobles and granted access to resources that transformed his modest experiments into an enterprise of unprecedented scale. The speed of his ascension was intoxicating. Where once Nikolaus had begged for scraps of funding to support his research, he now commanded budgets that could finance entire military campaigns. The king established a royal laboratory beneath the castle, equipped with the finest apparatus available in Christendom. Furnaces burned day and night, tended by servants who had been sworn to secrecy under penalty of death. Rare materials arrived from across Europe, acquired through royal decree and paid for from treasuries that had suddenly found new purpose. But with elevation came expectation, and with expectation came the terrible pressure that would define the remainder of Nikolaus's career. King Arthur did not merely want proof that transmutation was possible, he wanted production. The kingdom's wars required financing, the nobility demanded rewards for loyalty, and the church expected donations that would secure divine favor. All of this required gold, and the king believed that his alchemist could provide it in quantities limited only by imagination. Nikolaus found himself caught in a trap of his own making. Each successful transmutation raised expectations for the next demonstration. Each apparent breakthrough created demand for expanded production. Each miracle required a greater miracle to sustain belief and justify continued investment. The lie that had begun as a single performance evolved into an ongoing deception of staggering complexity.
The alchemist's solution was characteristically brilliant and morally corrupt. Rather than attempting to produce gold through genuine transmutation, which remained impossible, he established a network of acquisition and distribution that created the appearance of alchemical production while relying on conventional sources. Gold was purchased through intermediaries across Europe, smuggled into the kingdom through circuitous routes, and presented as the fruits of the great work. This required not just financial resources, but organizational genius.
Nicholas recruited merchants who specialized in precious metal trading, established relationships with mining operations in distant territories, and created a web of transactions so complex that even careful investigation would struggle to trace the true sources of his alchemical gold. The royal laboratory became the center of an international commerce network, disguised as mystical research. The king, desperate to believe and unwilling to examine the mechanics too closely, accepted each delivery of gold as confirmation of his alchemist's extraordinary abilities. Nicholas carefully managed these expectations, explaining that the great work required time, patience, and enormous expense. True transmutation, he claimed, was not a simple process, but a profound undertaking that demanded resources proportional to its miraculous results. This explanation served multiple purposes. It justified the enormous costs of his operation while creating reasonable expectations for production schedules. It maintained the mystical aura that protected him from too much scrutiny, while providing logical explanations for the practical limitations of his discoveries. Most importantly, it allowed him to control the flow of gold in ways that maximized both his influence and his personal wealth.
For Nicholas did not merely act as royal alchemist. He became the kingdom's de facto treasurer, the man through whom all gold flowed and by whose decisions the fate of campaigns and policies were determined. His position gave him leverage over nobles who desperately needed funding, influence with merchants who sought royal contracts, and power over the church hierarchy that depended on royal patronage. The transformation from humble scholar to shadow ruler took less than 2 years to complete. By 1314, there was virtually no aspect of the kingdom's affairs that did not somehow involve Nikolaus von Eckhart's expertise or approval. He had achieved a level of influence that transcended traditional hierarchies, becoming indispensable to a king who could no longer imagine governing without his alchemist's miraculous abilities. Yet with each expansion of his empire, Nicholas felt the weight of deception growing heavier. The simple lie that had begun as a demonstration of apparent transmutation had evolved into a systematic fraud that touched every aspect of the kingdom's economic and political life. He was no longer just deceiving the king. He was manipulating an entire realm through the sheer audacity of sustained falsehood. Success, Nicholas discovered, carried shadows that grew longer with each accumulated triumph. The first signs that his elaborate deception would exact a spiritual price came not as dramatic catastrophe, but as subtle wrongness that accumulated like poison in a well. The man who had once slept peacefully, sustained by the clear conscience of honest scholarship, now found rest elusive, and dreams haunted by visions that seemed to emerge from the deepest chambers of guilt. The nightmares began modestly, fleeting images of melting gold, laboratories consumed by unnatural flames, and faces twisted by disappointment when the truth would inevitably emerge. But as his deception expanded and deepened, these nocturnal torments grew more vivid and more specific. Nicholas began to dream of King Arthur's execution, of royal guards dragging him to dungeons where alchemists who had failed their monarchs rotted in chains. He saw himself burned as a heretic, hanged as a traitor, or simply disappearing into the kind of unmarked grave reserved for men whose crimes were too shameful to acknowledge publicly. More disturbing still were the dreams where his deception was revealed not through investigation or accident, but through his own compulsive confession. In these visions, Nikolaus would find himself standing before assembled courts, speaking truths he had never intended to reveal, watching as his carefully constructed empire crumbled through his own inability to maintain the lie any longer. He would wake from these dreams with his heart racing, uncertain whether they represented fear or desire, the terror of exposure or the secret longing for liberation from the burden of sustained fraud. His isolation deepened as success elevated him beyond normal human relationships. The common people regarded him with superstitious awe, making conversation impossible. The nobility treated him with careful deference that masked their suspicion and envy. Even his servants approached him with the fearful reverence reserved for those who trafficked in mysteries beyond mortal comprehension. Nikolaus had gained wealth and power, but lost the simple human connections that made life meaningful. Most painful was his estrangement from his sister Elizabeth, who had traveled from Germany to share in his apparent good fortune. She had arrived expecting to find the brother she remembered, learned, ethical, devoted to truth above worldly advancement. Instead, she encountered a man transformed by success into something she barely recognized. Elizabeth possessed the moral clarity that Nikolaus had surrendered, and her presence served as an unwelcome mirror, reflecting the extent of his spiritual corruption. Their conversations became exercises in mutual incomprehension. Elizabeth spoke of their childhood, their shared love of learning, their father's pride in his scholarly son. Nikolaus responded with discussions of royal favor, political influence, and the practical benefits of his elevated position. She asked about his research and discoveries. He deflected with vague references to proprietary knowledge and royal secrets. The gap between them widened with each exchange, until they could barely communicate across the chasms of his deception. Elizabeth's health began failing during her stay at court, declining in ways that physicians could not explain or treat. She complained of persistent fatigue, recurring fevers, and a general sense of spiritual malaise that seemed to worsen the longer she remained in proximity to her brother's activities. Nikolaus told himself that her condition was coincidental, unrelated to his work. But privately, he began to suspect that the spiritual contamination of his fraud was somehow affecting everyone close to him. The deterioration of his own mental state became impossible to ignore. Where once Nikolaus had possessed perfect recall for complex chemical formulas and philosophical principles, he now struggled to remember basic procedures. His hands, previously steady enough for the most delicate manipulations, began to shake uncontrollably during crucial operations. His ability to think clearly under pressure, the skill that had made his original deception possible, seemed to abandon him precisely when he needed it most. Most alarming were the episodes where Nikolaus would find himself speaking as if the transmutation were genuinely possible, as if his fraudulent demonstrations represented real discoveries rather than elaborate performances.
During these moments, he would explain the principles of the great work with complete conviction, describing processes and theories that existed only in his fabricated presentations. The boundary between truth and deception had become so blurred that he could no longer distinguish them with certainty. These manifestations of psychological strain created a terrible feedback loop. The more his mental state deteriorated, the more mistakes he made in maintaining his deception. The more mistakes he made, the greater the pressure to compensate through increasingly elaborate frauds. Each attempt to shore up the failing structure of his lies required greater effort and created greater opportunity for exposure. Nikolaus began to understand that Blackwood's warnings about cursed wealth applied equally to cursed knowledge. The gold he produced through deception carried the same spiritual contamination as money earned from others' suffering. His success had been purchased with integrity, and the price was being collected through the gradual destruction of everything that had once made him genuinely valuable.
By the winter of 1315, the magnificent edifice of Nikolaus von Eckhart's influence had grown so complex that maintaining it required the attention and energy of a man far more capable than he was becoming. The very success of his deception had created enemies whose opposition threatened to expose the elaborate fraud that sustained his power, while his deteriorating mental state made him increasingly vulnerable to the kind of scrutiny he could no longer confidently deflect. King Arthur's demands had evolved from periodic demonstrations of transmutation to expectations of continuous production that strained even Nikolaus's sophisticated network of gold acquisition. The royal treasury had become dependent on alchemical discoveries to finance military campaigns that were growing more expensive and less successful with each season. Worse still, the king had begun making promises to foreign allies based on his confidence in unlimited gold production, creating international obligations that could only be met through supernatural intervention or spectacular fraud. The pressure manifested most directly during royal audiences where Arthur would casually announce his alchemist's latest breakthrough to visiting dignitaries, describing capabilities that existed only in the monarch's imagination. These performances put Nikolaus in the impossible position of either contradicting his sovereign or accepting responsibility for miracles he could not possibly deliver. Each such encounter pushed him further toward the precipice where his deception would inevitably collapse under the weight of unrealistic expectations. More dangerous still was the growing sophistication of his opposition within the court. Lord Geoffrey de Montfort, the kingdom's chief treasurer, had begun asking increasingly pointed questions about the economics of alchemical gold production. His inquiries focused on practical matters: the cost of materials, the efficiency of processes, the scalability of operations that threatened to expose the fundamental impossibility of Nikolaus's claims. The treasurer's investigation was complicated by his political ambitions. De Montfort had held significant influence over royal finances before Nikolaus's elevation, and the alchemist's elevation had effectively displaced him from his traditional role. This created a powerful enemy whose personal interests aligned perfectly with his growing suspicions about the legitimacy of alchemical gold production.
De Montfort was not merely investigating fraud. He was seeking to reclaim power by exposing the foundations of his rival's influence.
Even more formidable was the opposition developing within the church hierarchy. Bishop Aldrich of Winchester, a man whose theological sophistication matched his political acumen, had begun questioning whether alchemical transmutation was compatible with Christian doctrine. His concerns focused not on the scientific possibility of transforming metals, but on the spiritual implications of claiming to replicate divine creative power through human knowledge and technique. The bishop's investigation took the form of theological inquiry rather than financial audit, making it far more difficult for Nikolaus to deflect or manipulate. Questions about the source of alchemical knowledge, the role of prayer in transmutation processes, and the moral implications of creating wealth through apparent miracles could not be answered with technical explanations or demonstrations of practical results. Bishop Aldrich was probing the spiritual dimensions of Nikolaus's work with the precision of a man trained to recognize heresy in its most subtle forms. The ecclesiastical threat was compounded by popular suspicion among the common people, who had begun attributing various misfortunes to the presence of unnatural forces at court. Crop failures, unusual weather patterns, and outbreaks of disease were being explained as divine punishment for tolerating practices that violated the natural order. This superstitious opposition created political pressure on King Arthur to demonstrate that his alchemist's activities enjoyed divine approval rather than divine condemnation. Nikolaus found himself fighting a three-front war against enemies whose different methodologies made unified defense nearly impossible. Financial scrutiny required detailed explanations of practical processes. Theological inquiry demanded philosophical justifications for moral choices, and popular suspicion needed dramatic demonstrations of divine favor. Each response to one form of attack created vulnerabilities that his other enemies could exploit. The stress of this sustained opposition accelerated his mental deterioration in ways that made effective defense increasingly difficult. During crucial confrontations, Nikolaus would find his memory failing, his arguments becoming circular, his explanations shifting in ways that revealed internal contradictions. The intellectual brilliance that had made his original deception possible seemed to abandon him precisely when he needed it most desperately. Most terrifying was his growing realization that exposure was becoming inevitable. The convergent pressures from his multiple enemies were creating a situation where even perfect performance might not be sufficient to maintain his position. Too many people had too many reasons to doubt him, and his deteriorating capabilities made the kind of spectacular demonstration that might silence critics increasingly unlikely to succeed. The walls were indeed closing in, but the greatest threat came not from external enemies, but from the internal collapse of the man who had created this magnificent deception. Nikolaus von Eckhart was discovering that the most elaborate lies eventually destroy the liar, and that no amount of external success can compensate for the spiritual devastation of sustained fraud.
The revelation arrived, as such moments often do, not through dramatic confrontation, but through the quiet accumulation of evidence that had finally reached critical mass. It was the feast of St. Nicholas in December 1315, and King Arthur had arranged a grand demonstration for visiting emissaries from France and the Holy Roman Empire. The stakes could not have been higher. Successful transmutation would secure international alliances and financing for the spring campaigns, while failure would expose the kingdom's weakness to enemies who would not hesitate to exploit such vulnerability. Nikolaus stood in the great hall, surrounded by the most powerful men in Christendom, with the weight of his entire deception resting upon a single performance. His hands shook as he prepared the familiar apparatus. His mind struggled to recall procedures he had executed hundreds of times, and his voice carried a tremor that had never been present during previous demonstrations. The deterioration that had been building for months was choosing this crucial moment to manifest most completely. The ceremony began according to the established pattern. Nikolaus displayed the lead that would be transformed, explained the principles of transmutation with the authority of a master scholar, and began the chemical processes that should have produced the illusion of miraculous change. But as he reached for the concealed gold that would be substituted for the base metal, his trembling fingers betrayed him. The hidden compartment that had operated flawlessly for years suddenly seemed foreign to his touch, its mechanism refusing to respond to fumbling hands that had lost their precision. What followed was a moment of silence that seemed to stretch across eternity. The crucible contained only the lead that had been placed there initially, transformed by heat and chemical reaction into something that remained unmistakably worthless. No amount of mystical explanation could disguise the fact that transmutation had not occurred, that the miracle which had sustained an empire of influence had failed to manifest when it was needed most desperately. King Arthur's face cycled through confusion, disappointment, and finally a cold fury that seemed to drain warmth from the entire hall. The visiting emissaries exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their revised assessment of the kingdom's capabilities and credibility. Lord de Montfort's expression revealed barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing the collapse of his rival's reputation. Bishop Aldrich watched with the serene patience of a man whose suspicions were being vindicated by divine justice.
But it was the look of complete betrayal in the king's eyes that finally shattered Nikolaus's remaining defenses. Here was a monarch who had staked his kingdom's future on the promise of unlimited gold, who had made commitments to allies based on confidence in supernatural wealth, who had believed with the desperate faith of a man who had no other hope for salvation. The failure of transmutation was not merely a disappointing experiment. It was the revelation that everything had been built upon lies. The moment stretched until Nikolaus could no longer bear the weight of collective accusation. In a voice that seemed to belong to someone else entirely, he began to speak words he had never intended to say. "Your Majesty, the transmutation, it has never been... I have never actually..." The confession emerged not as dramatic revelation, but as exhausted collapse. Nikolaus found himself admitting to deceptions he had maintained for years, describing techniques of fraud he had hoped would never be discovered, acknowledging that his entire reputation had been constructed upon systematic falsehood.
The words poured from him with the unstoppable force of water through a broken dam, carrying away the last remnants of the empire he had built through magnificent lies. King Arthur's response was not the explosive rage that Nikolaus had expected, but something far more devastating, complete withdrawal of the trust and friendship that had sustained their relationship. The monarch looked at his former confidant as if seeing a stranger, someone whose presence had become not merely unwelcome, but actively contaminating. The transformation from royal favorite to despised criminal took place in the space of a single conversation. The hall erupted into chaos as nobles began calculating how this revelation would affect their own positions and interests. Some called for immediate execution as punishment for treason against the crown. Others demanded investigation to determine the full extent of the fraud and identify any accomplices who might have participated in the deception. A few suggested that mercy might be appropriate for a man whose knowledge, even if misapplied, represented genuine learning that could serve the kingdom in other ways. But through all this tumult, Nikolaus stood in strange peace. The burden he had carried for years had finally been lifted, the terrible weight of sustained deception removed through the simple act of telling truth. Even facing execution, exile, or imprisonment, he felt a lightness he had not experienced since the night before his first fraudulent demonstration. The relief of honesty, even honest confession of dishonesty, provided a form of spiritual liberation that made the practical consequences seem almost insignificant. The climax was complete not when guards moved to arrest him, but in that moment when Nikolaus von Eckhart chose truth over continued deception and discovered that authenticity, even authentic admission of fraud, carried more dignity than the most successful lie ever could.
The unraveling of Nikolaus von Eckhart's empire proceeded with the same inexorable logic that had driven its creation, but in reverse. Where his rise had been built upon the careful accumulation of trust and the gradual expansion of influence, his fall was characterized by the systematic destruction of every relationship, every asset, and every achievement that had defined his transformation from humble scholar to royal confidant. King Arthur's vengeance was swift and comprehensive. Within hours of the failed demonstration, royal guards had seized Nikolaus's laboratories, confiscated his equipment, and begun inventorying assets that had been acquired through years of fraudulent practice. The investigation revealed the true scope of his deception. Not merely a single lie about transmutation, but an international network of gold acquisition that had involved merchants, miners, and intermediaries across Europe. The financial audit conducted by Lord de Montfort exposed the staggering scale of resources that had been diverted to maintain the illusion of alchemical production. The royal treasury had spent enormous sums purchasing gold that was then presented as the product of mystical transformation. Legitimate scholars and craftsmen had been displaced to make room for an operation that produced nothing but elaborate theater. The kingdom's international trade relationships had been distorted by the need to acquire precious metals through channels that would not reveal their true purpose. More devastating still was the diplomatic fallout from the exposure. The French and imperial emissaries returned to their courts with detailed reports of Arthur's deception, descriptions that would influence international relations for decades to come.
Alliance negotiations collapsed as potential partners questioned what other aspects of the kingdom's capabilities might be similarly fabricated. Trade agreements were reconsidered in light of doubts about the realm's financial stability and leadership competence. The Church moved swiftly to distance itself from any association with heretical practices. Bishop Aldrich announced a formal investigation into the theological implications of Nikolaus's activities, making clear that the Church had never endorsed alchemical transmutation as consistent with Christian doctrine. Priests who had accepted donations from the royal alchemist were required to make public penance, while churches that had been constructed with alchemical gold were reconsecrated to remove any spiritual contamination. But the cruelest aspect of Nikolaus's fall was its impact on the innocent people who had become entangled in his web of deception. His sister, Elizabeth, already weakened by mysterious illness, collapsed completely when news of the exposure reached her. The shock of discovering that her brother had become not merely successful but fraudulent proved more devastating than any physical ailment. She died within days, her last words a whispered question about how the moral man she had known in childhood had transformed into someone capable of such elaborate betrayal.
The servants and assistants who had worked in his laboratories faced interrogation and imprisonment as potential accomplices. Most had been genuinely ignorant of the fraud, believing they were participating in legitimate alchemical research. Their loyalty to a master they had respected made their treatment all the more tragic. They were punished for association with deception they had never recognized or chosen to support.
Nikolaus himself was stripped of all titles, properties, and privileges that had accumulated during his years of influence. The comfortable chambers that had housed his research became a cell where he awaited trial for charges that ranged from fraud to treason to heresy. The fine robes that had marked his elevation were replaced by simple cloth appropriate to his return to common status. The respect and deference he had enjoyed from nobles and commoners alike transformed into contempt and disgust. Yet even as he faced the destruction of everything he had built, Nikolaus found himself experiencing an unexpected emotion: relief. The constant pressure of maintaining elaborate deceptions had been lifted. The fear of exposure that had haunted his dreams for years had been replaced by the reality of consequences that, while severe, were at least knowable and finite. He no longer needed to remember which lies he had told to which people, no longer had to maintain the exhausting performance of omniscient wisdom, no longer bore the crushing weight of others' expectations based on capabilities he did not possess. The trial, when it came, was less legal proceeding than public spectacle. King Arthur, seeking to demonstrate that justice would be served and that he had been victim rather than accomplice in the deception, arranged for proceedings that would satisfy both his need for vengeance and the kingdom's hunger for explanation. Nikolaus was charged not only with fraud and theft, but with the more serious crime of treason, betraying the trust of his sovereign in ways that had endangered the realm's security and stability. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and largely provided by his own confession. Nobles who had been deceived testified about the impact of his lies on their decisions and investments. Merchants described their involvement in the gold acquisition network, painting pictures of international conspiracy that made Nikolaus appear far more dangerous than a single fraudulent scholar.
Church officials detailed the theological implications of his heretical claims, suggesting that his sins extended beyond mere financial deception to spiritual corruption that threatened souls. Nikolaus offered no defense because none was possible. The facts of his deception were undeniable, the consequences of his actions were evident to all, and the moral dimensions of his choices admitted no justification. He stood before his judges as a man who had traded integrity for influence and discovered that the bargain had destroyed not only his victims, but himself as well. The sentence, when pronounced, was exile rather than execution, a mercy that King Arthur granted not from forgiveness, but from a desire to forget completely the man who had made him appear foolish before the world. Nikolaus would be stripped of all possessions, banished from the kingdom permanently, and forbidden to practice alchemy or claim scholarly credentials anywhere within Arthur's influence. He would leave as he had arrived years earlier, a wandering scholar with nothing but the knowledge in his mind and the clothes on his back.
Nikolaus von Eckhart died as he had begun his adult life, a wandering scholar with no fixed abode and no worldly possessions beyond the accumulated weight of hard-earned wisdom. But the story of his rise and fall became something far more significant than the biography of a single fraudulent alchemist. It evolved into a parable that would echo through the ages, a cautionary tale about the price of ambition untempered by moral restraint. The immediate aftermath of his exposure transformed King Arthur's court in ways that no genuine alchemical discovery could have achieved. The revelation that royal policies had been based on fraudulent premises forced a comprehensive reevaluation of decision-making processes and advisory relationships. Never again would a single counselor be granted the kind of unchecked influence that Nikolaus had wielded, nor would claims of extraordinary capability be accepted without independent verification. Lord de Montfort, elevated to replace the disgraced alchemist, implemented financial controls and auditing procedures that brought unprecedented transparency to royal expenditures. The treasury, no longer dependent on magical gold production, was forced to develop sustainable revenue sources through improved tax collection, expanded trade relationships, and more efficient resource management. Paradoxically, the kingdom's finances became more stable after losing their supernatural foundation than they had ever been while relying on apparent miracles. The Church, stung by its association with heretical practices, embarked on a systematic campaign to distinguish legitimate natural philosophy from forbidden attempts to replicate divine power. Bishop Aldrich's theological investigations produced guidelines that would influence church doctrine for centuries, establishing clear boundaries between acceptable scientific inquiry and blasphemous claims to supernatural knowledge. The scandal had forced ecclesiastical authorities to develop more sophisticated understanding of the relationship between faith and reason. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Nikolaus's deception was its impact on the practice of alchemy itself. Word of his fraud spread throughout Europe's scholarly community, creating skepticism that forced genuine alchemists to develop more rigorous standards of evidence and more honest methods of presentation. The field, purged of its most obvious charlatans by association with Nikolaus's disgrace, began to evolve toward what would eventually become the legitimate science of chemistry. The irony was profound. Nikolaus's fraudulent alchemy had accomplished more for the advancement of genuine natural philosophy than years of honest research might have achieved. His spectacular failure had created the intellectual crisis necessary to separate superstition from science,
performance from investigation, and wishful thinking from empirical observation. The man who had lied about transmutation had inadvertently catalyzed the transformation of medieval mysticism into modern scientific method. Individual lives touched by his deception were similarly transformed, though not always in positive ways. The servants and assistants who had worked innocently in his laboratories carried the stigma of association with fraud for the remainder of their careers. Many were forced to abandon scholarly pursuits entirely, their reputations too damaged by connection to his practices to permit continued work in natural philosophy. They became casualties of his ambition, their honest service punished by proximity to his dishonesty.
Yet some found in the experience a different kind of education. Those who had observed his methods most closely gained insight into the mechanisms of deception that made them more discerning judges of extraordinary claims. They became the skeptical voices in subsequent generations, the men who demanded evidence rather than accepting demonstrations, who questioned motives rather than trusting appearances. Nikolaus had inadvertently trained a cadre of fraud investigators whose expertise would protect future generations from similar deceptions. The story itself became a teaching tool used by moralists, theologians, and philosophers to illustrate the corrupting power of unchecked ambition. Universities incorporated his tale into curricula designed to prepare scholars for the ethical challenges they would face when knowledge intersected with power. Monasteries used his example in sermons about the dangers of pride and the importance of intellectual humility. Most haunting was the question that his story raised about the nature of success and failure. Nikolaus had achieved everything he had thought he wanted: wealth, influence, recognition, and the power to shape events on a grand scale. Yet these accomplishments had ultimately revealed themselves as worthless when achieved through methods that destroyed the very qualities that had made him capable of earning them honestly. His success had been his damnation, while his failure had been, in its way, his salvation. The final irony was that Nikolaus had indeed discovered the secret of transmutation, though not in the way he had originally imagined. He had learned that the most profound changes occurred not in the laboratory, but in the soul, that the most valuable transformations involved character rather than chemicals, and that the true great work was the lifelong process of becoming worthy of the knowledge one possessed, rather than clever enough to misuse it. The Shadow Tome preserves his memory, not as a villain to be despised, but as a complex figure whose choices illuminate the eternal tension between aspiration and integrity. His story serves as a mirror in which ambitious souls might recognize their own potential for both greatness and corruption, and perhaps choose more wisely when faced with the temptation to purchase worldly success through spiritual compromise. In the end, Nikolaus von Eckhart's greatest achievement was becoming a cautionary tale, profound enough to prevent others from repeating his mistakes. The alchemist who had lied to a king had ultimately served truth more faithfully through his exposure than he ever had through his deceptions, proving that even the most elaborate fraud can be transformed into genuine wisdom by those humble enough to learn from its consequences. The quest for gold had indeed forged an empire, but the most enduring creation was not wealth or influence, but understanding. The hard-won knowledge that some prices are too high to pay, some ambitions too dangerous to pursue, and some transformations too costly to survive. That wisdom extracted from the ruins of magnificent deception became Nikolaus von Eckhart's true legacy to a world that would long remember the alchemist who lied to a king and discovered that the most profound changes occur not in crucibles, but in the crucible of moral choice.